The old janitor had seen many things in his life: hotel hallways filled with the rich and powerful broken systems, and lives shattered by the smallest of decisions. But nothing could have prepared Jim Carter for what he would uncover in the quiet, innocuous hallways of Hillcrest Academy. The secrets he was about to stumble upon wouldn't just change the course of his own life, but they would also shake the very foundation of the school, a place that prided itself on keeping its reputation pristine. Jim was about to find out that some things are better left unsaid, and some secrets, once uncovered, can never be hidden again. It was a typical Tuesday morning when Jim Carter arrived at Hillcrest Academy for his second day as the new janitor. At 40 years old, his life had been one of quiet failure, never quite fitting in, never quite reaching the heights he once dreamed of. After years of working at high-end hotels, his new job at a modest school felt like a step back. But it was a job, and that's all that mattered. The school was eerily silent when Jim arrived, the kind of stillness that only comes from a place where the noise of children's laughter and chatter is absent for a moment. The floors gleamed from their morning cleaning, the walls freshly painted, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, a far cry from the polished marble lobbies and freshly cut roses of the luxury hotel he had once worked at. As Jim moved his mop across the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoed unnervingly, almost as if the building was watching him. The echo bounced off the walls, a reminder that he was a stranger in this world of structured chaos. With a sigh, he pushed his cart along the corridor, feeling the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. But then, out of the corner of his eye, something unusual caught his attention. It was a girl, small, with dark hair and a school uniform that hung just a little too loosely around her thin frame. She was standing by a row of lockers, staring down at the ground, her fingers tightly clutching a small carton of milk. There was something off about her, something Jim couldn't quite put his finger on. She didn't belong here, or at least, it felt like she didn't. As Jim pushed his cart closer, the girl suddenly looked up, her wide eyes locking with his. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Jim's heart skipped a beat. The look in her eyes wasn't just curiosity, it was desperation, a silent cry for help. But before he could even move toward her, another student rushed past, slamming into her shoulder and knocking the carton of milk from her hands. The milk splashed across the freshly mopped floor, soaking her shoes and leaving a trail of white behind. The girl didn't scream. She didn't even shout. She just stood there, frozen, her gaze flicking from the spilled milk to the mess she'd created. Jim could see the frustration building in her face, her lips trembling as if she was about to break down. But she didn't. Instead, she quietly bent down to clean up the mess herself, her movements mechanical, almost robotic. She didn't even look at him as she wiped away the milk with a scrap of tissue from her bag. Something was very wrong. Jim could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut through. It wasn't just the accident, the girl's isolation, her reluctance to interact. The way she avoided everyone at all painted a darker picture, one that made Jim question everything he thought he knew about the school. "Hey," he said, stepping forward, his voice gentle, almost too soft for the space between them. "It's okay, I'll clean it up." The girl barely nodded, not meeting his gaze. She didn't respond, didn't offer a word of gratitude. She just turned and walked toward the door, blending into the background like a shadow, unnoticed and unseen by the other children rushing past her. But Jim couldn't shake the feeling that he had just seen something know, someone he wasn't supposed to. His eyes followed her as she entered the classroom, the door clicking shut behind her with an eerie finality. He lingered by the hallway, staring at the spot where she had stood, a strange unease gnawing at his gut. What was that about? Jim knew the school had a reputation for being a place of excellence. Its walls had been built to keep secrets, to protect its image at all costs. But the girl, the way she'd acted, the isolation she carried, it didn't sit right with him. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something hidden in plain sight, and Jim couldn't let it go. Not this time. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a coincidence, just another lonely child lost in the shuffle. But deep down, he knew this was no accident. Something bigger was unfolding, and Jim was standing right at the edge of it. Jim had never been one to push himself into situations where he didn't belong. He liked to stay in the background, unnoticed, as he had done for most of his life. But something about that girl, her silent plea, her isolation gnawed at him. The feeling wasn't just some passing concern. It was deeper, almost like a sixth sense whispering at him from the dark corners of the school. And as much as he wanted to brush it off as nothing, he couldn't. The days that followed were oddly quiet. The school's routine continued, students rushing through the hallways, teachers barking orders, and the headmaster's stern face always present. But Jim couldn't stop thinking about the girl. Every time he passed that hallway, he'd glance toward the lockers where she had been standing, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. Yet she remained elusive, as if she had vanished into thin air. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, it happened again. Jim was cleaning the back corner of the library, pushing his mop slowly across the dusty floor, when he heard the familiar sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. But these weren't the usual hurried steps of students late for class. These were slow, almost methodical, as if someone were carefully considering each step they took. Jim glanced up from his work, and there she was standing in the hallway just beyond the library door, staring directly at him. The girl, her eyes were darker now, shadows under them as if she hadn't slept in days. Her hair hung in messy tangles, and her uniform, once neat, was now slightly wrinkled, the top button of her blouse undone. She looked different, as though something inside her had shifted, broken, or perhaps fractured entirely. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them thickened, and Jim felt the unmistakable weight of the unspoken words hanging in the space. "Are you okay?" Jim finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, unsure if he should even speak to her. His heart was racing now, his every instinct telling him to walk away, to let her be. But his feet remained planted. She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze shifted down the hallway, past him, like she was searching for something or someone. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, she turned and darted down the corridor, disappearing around the corner before Jim could even react. What was that about? Jim stood frozen for a second, his mind racing. Something was terribly wrong. He could feel it like the air before a storm, and if he didn't get to the bottom of it, he knew he'd never be able to rest. He made up his mind then and there. He wasn't going to let this go. Later that evening, Jim decided to take matters into his own hands. After most of the staff had left and the school was quiet, he slipped into the administrator's office. The lights were off, and the only sound was the hum of the old ceiling fan above him. Jim's eyes scanned the room as he stepped toward the filing cabinet, his pulse quickening. He'd seen enough students come and go over the years to know when something was wrong, and now he was certain there was something about this school, something hidden in plain sight. The file cabinets were organized, their contents neatly labeled. He pulled out a random folder, and as he flipped through it, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then he found it. A small, unmarked envelope tucked behind a file. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper folded in half. Jim's fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper, his breath catching in his throat when he saw the words written in bold, hurried handwriting. "She doesn't belong here. Keep her isolated, keep her quiet, she knows too much." His stomach dropped. The words were chilling, a direct threat. But against who? Jim's mind raced as he tried to piece together the meaning. The girl, was she a witness to something? Or was she involved in whatever dark secrets the school was trying to hide? His hand gripped the paper tightly as a new understanding began to form. Whoever wrote this note, whoever was trying to control this girl, had far more power than he ever could have imagined. And this wasn't just about a lonely student, it was about a much larger, more dangerous game. Jim's heart pounded as he slipped the note back into the envelope and hid it back in the drawer. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. The next morning, he decided to confront the girl. She had to know something, right? She was the key to all of this. He found her sitting alone in the school's abandoned courtyard during lunch break, her small figure barely visible behind the tall, overgrown hedges. The other students ate and laughed nearby, oblivious to the fact that someone, just a few feet away, was silently suffering. "Hey," Jim said, trying to sound casual. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't look up, but he could see her shoulders tense at the sound of his voice. I know you're going through something, Jim continued, his voice soft but insistent. I don't know what it is, but I want to help. You're not alone. The girl lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time Jim saw something that broke his heart. Fear. Pure, unfiltered terror. She stood abruptly, her hand trembling as she clutched the strap of her bag. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice shaky. You have to stay away. Please, Jim said, his voice low. What's going on? What are they doing to you? But before she could answer, she spun around and fled, her feet pounding against the cracked concrete as she disappeared into the maze of school buildings. Jim was left standing there, feeling the weight of the situation more than ever before. This wasn't just about a girl in trouble. This was something much bigger, a secret so dark that someone was willing to go to any lengths to protect it. And Jim had just become a part of it. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, each step taking him further from the safe, predictable life he had known. The girl's terrified face was burned into his mind, but it was the cryptic warning she had given him that haunted him the most. You don't understand. Stay away. But it was too late. He couldn't back down now. He had already crossed a line by investigating the administrator's office, reading that strange note. He had seen too much, and his curiosity wouldn't allow him to turn away. Over the next few days, he shadowed her carefully at first, blending in with the crowd of students, watching from the sidelines. Her every movement seemed to carry an air of urgency, as if she was perpetually on edge, waiting for something to happen. But whatever it was, Jim still didn't know. It was the following Friday afternoon. A storm was rolling in, and the clouds had darkened the sky, turning the school's once cheery halls into a foreboding place. Jim knew something was going to happen tonight, could feel it in his bones. As soon as the final bell rang, Jim didn't follow the usual routine. He didn't pack his things and head home like everyone else. He waited. He watched the girl walk out of the main building with her head down, hands in her pockets. She was alone. This time, Jim didn't hesitate. He followed her. Her footsteps were quick and nervous, and Jim kept his distance, moving quietly between the shadows of the long corridors. He knew she wasn't heading to the bus stop, and she certainly wasn't going to walk home alone. No, she was heading somewhere he needed to be. Just when Jim thought he'd lost her, he saw her slip through a small door at the back of the school, an entrance he had never noticed before. It was hidden in the shadows, tucked away behind a thick layer of ivy. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the door, his breath quickening as he reached for the handle. To his surprise, the door creaked open, revealing a dark stairwell descending into the basement. Jim hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave it alone, but he couldn't. He had to know what was going on, why the girl was so afraid, and what dangerous game the school had been playing. His heart pounded in his chest as he descended into the unknown. The air down here was thick with dust, the smell of damp stone clinging to the walls. His footfalls echoed eerily as he moved deeper into the bowels of the school, the only light coming from the faint glow of his phone's screen. Then, just as he reached the bottom, he saw it, the faint outline of a door at the far end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could make out faint murmurs, the sound of voices. He crept closer, his pulse racing as he approached the door. This was it. Pushing the door open just a little further, he peered inside. What he saw made his stomach churn. The room was filled with people. There were teachers, administrators, and shockingly several students, including the girl. They were all gathered around a large table, each of them wearing a look of grim determination. But it wasn't the people that made Jim's blood run cold. It was what they were doing. They were holding something for, rather. Someone. The girl he had been following stood at the center, her back rigid, her head tilted as if she were listening to someone. But this wasn't the frightened girl he had seen earlier. This was something different. Her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to radiate a coldness that chilled Jim to his core. She was no longer the terrified, vulnerable student. This was someone else, someone dangerous. Tonight is the night. A voice murmured from the table. Jim strained to hear, but the words were so quiet. It was as if they were speaking in code. But what he heard next made his blood run cold. She's ready. She knows everything. There was a low chuckle from one of the administrators. Good. It's time we end this charade. Jim's heart raced. In this charade? What did that mean? What were they going to do with the girl? Suddenly, a voice from behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. Don't move. Jim spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. A tall, imposing figure stood in the doorway behind him, one of the teachers from earlier in the week. The teacher's eyes were cold, a look of recognition crossing his face as he stepped closer. You've seen too much, the teacher said, his voice low, almost sympathetic. But now, you have a choice. You can walk away, or you can join us. Jim felt a surge of anger and disbelief. Join them? What were they even doing here? You're not going to stop this, the teacher continued, taking a step closer. You can't. We've already come too far. His eyes narrowed. And you have no idea what you're dealing with. Who are you people? Jim's voice shook, but his resolve hardened. What are you doing to her? The teacher gave him a cold smile. She's not who you think she is. None of them are. Before Jim could react, the teacher lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him into the room. No! Jim struggled, but the teacher's grip was like iron. The others in the room turned their heads toward Jim, their faces expressionless, like they had all been waiting for this moment. The girl, the thing that had once been the girl, looked at him, her gaze empty, almost amused. This is your last chance, the teacher whispered. Do you want to know the truth? Jim's heart hammered in his chest. The truth. He had no idea what was happening. But one thing was clear, whatever this was, it was bigger than anything he could have imagined. The question lingered in the air, heavy and ominous. Jim's pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly inched toward the principal's office, his mind racing. He had already seen enough. He could feel something was terribly wrong. But now, as he hovered at the door, his instinct screamed at him to leave, to turn around and walk away. Yet, curiosity kept him rooted to the spot, his hand trembling as he pressed his ear to the cold wood of the office door. For a long, unbearable moment, silence. Then muffled voices too faint to make out. It was the only thing he could focus on as he listened, trying to decipher what was happening on the other side. His heart clenched in his chest when he finally heard a door open, and a figure emerged, Maya. Her face was pale, eyes wide, but there was something else in her expression, a look of absolute terror. It struck Jim like a bolt of lightning. There was no sign of the rebellious, frustrated student from earlier. Instead, she looked broken, a shell of the girl he had seen earlier, her movements stiff and robotic. Maya didn't even glance at him as she walked past, her shoulders hunched, her eyes downcast. The principal, Charles Robinson, stepped out right behind her. His face, usually so composed, was now hard, and his eyes cold, calculating, narrowed as they met Jim's. You? What are you doing here? Robinson's voice was low, dangerous. Jim stepped back instinctively, his heart sinking. I was just cleaning the area, he stammered, trying to mask the suspicion in his voice. But his gaze lingered on Maya's retreating figure. Something wasn't right. The principal's eyes followed Jim's, and for a second, they locked onto his with an intensity that made Jim's blood run cold. Mind your business, Jim. This is none of your concern. Robinson's voice was as smooth as velvet, but there was an edge to it, something dark lurking beneath. Jim's instincts were screaming at him to turn around and leave, but the image of Maya's hollow expression burned in his mind. Something was horribly wrong. Before he could respond, the principal turned on his heel, grabbing Maya by the arm with a force that sent a shiver down Jim's spine. Back to your classroom, Maya, Robinson growled, his grip tightening. Maya didn't even flinch. She simply obeyed, walking ahead like a puppet on a string. Jim stood frozen, his hand gripping the mop handle tightly as he watched them disappear down the corridor. His thoughts raced. Something wasn't right, not at all. Just as he was about to turn and continue his work, he caught a faint voice from behind him, Eileen, the receptionist. She appeared in the hallway with a knowing, almost pitying look in her eyes. I told you to mind your business, Eileen muttered under her breath, but there was a dark, almost haunted tone to her voice. She glanced quickly over her shoulder at the principal's office, her face tightening in fear. Don't get involved, Jim, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've seen things you wouldn't believe, Things I wish I never knew. Eileen's words were heavy, and Jim could feel the weight of them pressing against his chest. Before Jim could ask more, Eileen was gone, disappearing into the restrooms with a quick, purposeful step. Her warning echoed in his ears as he stood there, fighting the urge to run. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late. He had to know the truth. Whatever was happening at Hillcrest Academy, whatever was going on behind closed doors was beyond his understanding. But his need for justice burned hotter than his fear. Jim made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go. He moved toward the principal's office once more, this time determined. His heart pounded as he gripped the knob and pushed the door open, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Maya was sitting in a chair, her back to him, her eyes vacant, lost. Robinson stood by the desk, his eyes glaring at Jim as he entered. "What do you want now, Jim? Didn't I tell you to stay out of this?" The principal's voice was like ice, his fingers tapping on the desk with an eerie rhythm. Jim stood his ground, though every part of him wanted to flee. "Two can't leave it alone," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I saw the way you treated Maya. She was different before she came out of here." Robinson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jim thought he saw a flicker of fear-something that quickly vanished behind a mask of indifference. "Maya is a troubled student," Robinson said coldly. "She's acting out. I'm just making sure she learns the discipline she needs." But Jim could hear the lie in his voice. There was something far more sinister at play here. He didn't know what it was yet, but he was determined to find out. Suddenly, Jim felt something shift behind him. A cold wind seemed to sweep through the room. His eyes shot to the window, but the air felt wrong. There was something off about the atmosphere. He turned back to the principal. "You're hiding something," Jim said, his voice gaining strength. The principal's lips curled into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about, Jim." He moved closer to Jim, his breath cold against Jim's ear. "But you will soon, and then you'll wish you had never come here." Jim's blood ran cold. He knew, in that instant, that he had uncovered something that had been buried deep within this school for far too long. And then the door slammed shut behind him.